Behind the golden gates of Aldermere Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern ambition, a storm is brewing that threatens to tear apart the very foundation of the monarchy. When Crown Prince Alexander discovers a web of deception that reaches into the heart of the royal household, he must choose between family loyalty and the future of the crown itself. In a world where every whisper becomes headline news and every decision carries the weight of a nation, some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried. But what happens when exposing the truth means destroying everything you've sworn to protect? The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Aldermere Palace as Crown Prince Alexander walked through the dimly lit corridors that had housed his family for over 3 centuries. At 38, he carried himself with the measured dignity expected of a future king, yet tonight something troubled him deeply. The weight of recent discoveries pressed heavily on his shoulders as he made his way to his father's private study. King Edmund sat behind his mahogany desk, looking far older than his 65 years. The crown had aged him rapidly, especially since his marriage to Duchess Vivian 3 years prior. What was meant to bring happiness to the widowed king had instead created an undercurrent of tension that rippled through the entire royal household. Alexander knocked softly before entering. His father looked up with tired eyes, and Alexander could see the strain of recent months etched in every line of his face. The king's health had been declining, though the palace had managed to keep this information from reaching the public. Only the inner circle knew how serious Edmund's condition had become. "Father, we need to talk," Alexander said, settling into the leather chair across from the desk. The room smelled of old books and the faint trace of his father's pipe tobacco, a comfort from childhood that now seemed distant. King Edmund set down the papers he had been reviewing. These late-night meetings between father and son had become more frequent as Alexander gradually took on more royal duties. However, tonight felt different. There was an urgency in Alexander's voice that the king recognized. "What troubles you, my son?" Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Alexander pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the desk between them. For weeks, he had been investigating strange financial transactions that seemed to originate from accounts connected to the royal household. What he discovered went far beyond simple accounting errors. The documents revealed a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts, all somehow linked to Duchess Vivian's financial advisors. Money that should have gone to various royal charities was being diverted, redirected through a maze of transactions that would be nearly impossible for outsiders to trace. The amounts were staggering, representing millions that had been meant for hospitals, schools, and social programs across the kingdom. King Edmund's face grew pale as he examined the evidence. His wife, the woman he had married for love after years of loneliness following the Queen's death, appeared to be systematically stealing from the very charities they publicly supported. The irony was bitter. Vivian had built her public image around charitable work and social causes. "How did you discover this?" the king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander explained how his suspicions had first been raised during a routine review of charitable expenditures. As someone who took his royal duties seriously, he regularly checked on the progress of their various philanthropic initiatives. When several charity directors mentioned delays in receiving promised funds, Alexander decided to investigate personally rather than delegating the task to palace staff. His investigation led him down a rabbit hole of financial complexity that took weeks to unravel. Using discreet inquiries and the help of a trusted financial advisor who had served the royal family for decades, Alexander slowly pieced together the scope of what appeared to be an elaborate embezzlement scheme. The evidence suggested that Vivian had been planning this from the very beginning of her relationship with the king. Her background check before their marriage had been thorough, but it appeared that she had expertly hidden her true intentions and financial desperation. She had debts and obligations that no one in the royal family knew about, stemming from failed business ventures and a lifestyle she could no longer afford to maintain. King Edmund sat in stunned silence as Alexander continued to explain his findings. The documents showed that approximately £15 million had been diverted over the past 2.5 years. The money had been funneled through various accounts before eventually ending up in Vivian's personal holdings, cleverly disguised as consulting fees and administrative costs. What made the situation even more devastating was the timing. The kingdom was facing economic challenges, and the royal family had publicly committed to increasing their charitable contributions to help struggling communities. Citizens were making sacrifices while their future queen was secretly stealing from the very programs meant to help them. Alexander watched his father's face crumble as the full implications became clear. This was not just about money. It was about trust, duty, and the fundamental principles upon which the monarchy stood. If this information became public, it would create a scandal that could seriously damage the royal family's reputation and potentially destabilize the entire institution of the monarchy. The rain continued to pound against the windows as both men sat in contemplative silence. King Edmund's health was already fragile, and this revelation seemed to drain what little strength he had left. Alexander felt a mixture of anger toward Vivian and deep concern for his father's well-being. Finally, the king spoke. "What do you propose we do about this?" It was a question that Alexander had been wrestling with for days. On one hand, his duty to the crown and to the people demanded that justice be served. On the other hand, exposing Vivian would likely destroy his father, both personally and politically. The king had already endured the loss of his beloved first wife. Learning that his second wife had betrayed him so completely might be more than he could bear. Alexander had considered various options. They could handle the matter quietly, forcing Vivian to return the money and leave the royal family without public disclosure. Alternatively, they could pursue criminal charges, which would inevitably become public and create a media firestorm that would overshadow everything the royal family was trying to accomplish. There was also the question of complicity. How much did other members of Vivian's inner circle know about her activities? The investigation had revealed that at least 2 of her closest advisors were involved in facilitating the financial transfers. This meant the conspiracy extended beyond just Vivian herself. As Alexander presented these options to his father, he could see the internal struggle playing out across the king's features. Edmund had always prided himself on being a moral leader, someone who upheld the highest standards of integrity. Yet he was also a man who had found love again after years of grief and loneliness. The conversation stretched late into the night as father and son grappled with impossible choices. Alexander shared his research methodology, explaining how he had verified each piece of evidence multiple times to ensure accuracy. He had even secretly recorded some conversations with financial institutions to protect himself legally and to ensure that his allegations could be substantiated if necessary. King Edmund asked detailed questions about the evidence, occasionally requesting clarification on specific financial transactions. It was clear that he was trying to find some alternative explanation, some way that his wife might be innocent of the charges. However, as Alexander methodically walked through each piece of evidence, any hope of Vivian's innocence faded away. The most damning evidence came in the form of email communications that Alexander had managed to obtain through his investigation. These messages showed Vivian discussing the diversion of funds with her financial advisors, using coded language, but clearly indicating her awareness and approval of the scheme. There was no way to interpret these communications as anything other than deliberate criminal activity. As dawn began to break over the palace grounds, both men remained in the study, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal that would forever change their family. The decision of what to do next would not only affect their personal lives, but could potentially alter the course of the monarchy itself. Alexander knew that whatever choice they made, there would be consequences that rippled far beyond the palace walls. The people of the kingdom trusted the royal family to be stewards of their charitable contributions and to represent the highest ideals of service and integrity. That trust had been violated in the most fundamental way possible. The weight of this knowledge sat heavily on both their shoulders as they prepared to face whatever came next. 3 days after the devastating revelation, Crown Prince Alexander found himself in an impossible position. His father, King Edmund, had retreated into himself, spending most of his time in his private chambers and avoiding all but the most essential royal duties. The king's physician had been called discreetly, as Edmund's already fragile health seemed to be deteriorating rapidly under the stress of learning about his wife's betrayal. Alexander had taken on additional responsibilities, covering for his father while trying to maintain the appearance that everything was normal within the royal household. However, he knew that this facade could not continue indefinitely. Palace staff were beginning to notice the king's absence and Duchess Vivian's increasingly erratic behavior. Vivian seemed to sense that something had changed. She had always been perceptive, which was part of what had made her so effective at concealing her criminal activities for so long. Now she appeared nervous, asking pointed questions about Alexander's recent activities and showing unusual interest in his meetings and correspondence. Alexander decided that he needed more evidence before taking any decisive action. Working with Sir Marcus Whitfield, the the family's longtime financial advisor and one of the few people he trusted completely, Alexander expanded his investigation. They discovered that the scope of Vivian's activities was even broader than initially suspected. The investigation revealed that Vivian had been using her position to influence government contracts and business deals, accepting payments from companies in exchange for royal endorsements or access to exclusive events. She had essentially been selling the influence and prestige of the royal family for personal gain. This went far beyond simple embezzlement. It was corruption at the highest levels of the monarchy. Sir Marcus, a man in his 70s who had served 3 generations of the royal family, was visibly shaken by their discoveries. He had always taken pride in maintaining the financial integrity of the royal household, and Vivian's activities had been conducted in ways that initially bypassed his oversight. She had exploited gaps in the system and used her relationship with the king to establish independent financial channels. The evidence showed that Vivian had been particularly clever in her approach. Rather than stealing large amounts at once, which might have been noticed, she had taken smaller amounts consistently over time. She had also timed many of her transactions to coincide with major royal events or charitable campaigns, when increased financial activity would be less likely to attract attention. One of the most disturbing discoveries was that Vivian had been selling access to confidential royal information to tabloid journalists. Several stories that had appeared in gossip magazines over the past year could be traced back to information that only she would have had access to. She had been betraying family secrets and private moments for money, adding another layer of violation to her crimes. Alexander confronted this reality while reviewing security footage from various royal events. The footage showed Vivian having discreet conversations with individuals who were later identified as journalists or representatives from media companies. Phone records obtained through their investigation confirmed regular contact between Vivian and several media personalities known for paying for royal stories. The financial trail of these media payments was particularly well hidden, flowing through entertainment companies and publicity firms before eventually reaching accounts controlled by Vivian. She had clearly learned from experience how to structure these transactions to avoid detection, suggesting that this behavior predated her marriage to the king. As Alexander compiled this additional evidence, he also began to understand the personal motivations behind Vivian's actions. Background research revealed that she had been facing serious financial difficulties before meeting King Edmund. Her previous marriage had ended in expensive litigation, and she had made several poor investment decisions that left her with significant debt. Rather than being honest about her financial situation, Vivian had seen her relationship with the king as an opportunity to solve her problems through deception. She had approached the relationship not as a genuine romantic connection, but as a business opportunity that she could exploit for financial gain. This revelation was perhaps even more devastating than the criminal activities themselves. King Edmund had genuinely loved Vivian and had believed that she loved him in return. Learning that their entire relationship had been built on deception and manipulation would crush him emotionally, especially given his continued grief over the loss of his first wife. Alexander struggled with the decision of whether to share this additional information with his father. The king was already struggling to cope with the knowledge of Vivian's theft from charities. Learning that their entire relationship had been fraudulent from the beginning might be more than his fragile emotional and physical state could handle. Meanwhile, Vivian's behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious. She had begun asking detailed questions about the family's financial reviews and had even attempted to gain access to Sir Marcus's files. When these attempts were rebuffed, she became more demanding, using her position as the king's wife to try to pressure staff members into providing information. Alexander realized that Vivian was likely conducting her own investigation, trying to determine how much they knew about her activities. This created an urgent timeline pressure. If she suspected that her crimes had been discovered, she might attempt to destroy evidence or flee the country before they could take action. The situation became even more complex when Alexander discovered that Vivian had been in contact with foreign business interests. Some of the money she had received appeared to come from companies with ties to foreign governments. This raised the possibility that her activities might constitute not just theft and fraud, but potentially espionage or treason. Intelligence services were discreetly contacted to investigate these foreign connections without revealing the broader scope of the royal family's internal crisis. Initial reports suggested that while Vivian had been reckless in her business dealings, there was no evidence of deliberate intelligence gathering or state secrets being compromised. However, the investigation was ongoing, and more serious charges might be forthcoming. Alexander found himself managing multiple crises simultaneously. He had to continue covering for his father's increasing absence from royal duties while conducting a complex financial investigation and potentially preparing for criminal proceedings. All of this had to be done while maintaining absolute secrecy to prevent media speculation or public panic about the stability of the monarchy. The stress was taking its toll on Alexander as well. He had always taken his royal responsibilities seriously, but this situation was testing him in ways he had never imagined. The weight of potentially having to choose between protecting his father and serving justice was emotionally exhausting. Late one evening, as Alexander reviewed the latest evidence in his private office, he received an unexpected visitor. Princess Catherine, his younger sister who lived mostly away from royal duties, had returned to the palace for what she thought was a routine family visit. However, she quickly sensed that something was seriously wrong. Catherine had always been perceptive about family dynamics, and she immediately noticed the tension between Alexander and Vivian, as well as their father's obvious distress. When she pressed Alexander for information, he faced another difficult decision about how much to reveal and to whom. After careful consideration, Alexander decided to confide in his sister. Catherine had a law degree and had worked in the private sector before taking on limited royal duties. Her outside perspective and legal knowledge could be valuable in determining the best course of action. Moreover, as a member of the royal family, she had a right to know about threats to the monarchy's stability. Catherine's reaction to the evidence was one of shocked disbelief followed by cold anger. She had never particularly liked Vivian, sensing something artificial about her public persona, but she had never suspected anything approaching this level of betrayal. Her legal training immediately focused on the strength of the evidence and the potential legal remedies available. Together, the siblings began to develop a strategy for addressing the crisis. They knew that whatever action they took would have to be swift and decisive to prevent further damage to the royal family's reputation and to the charitable organizations that had been victimized by Vivian's crimes. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions, and Alexander knew that they were rapidly approaching a point where decisive action would be required. The confrontation came sooner than expected. On a cold Thursday morning, as Alexander was meeting with Sir Marcus to review additional financial evidence, Duchess Vivian stormed into the private office without knocking. Her usually perfect composure was cracking, and her eyes held a dangerous glint that Alexander had never seen before. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "All these secret meetings, all the whispered conversations. You've been investigating me." Alexander remained calm, though his heart raced. He and Sir Marcus exchanged a quick glance, and Marcus discreetly moved toward the door to ensure their privacy. Alexander had been preparing for this moment, but facing Vivian's direct confrontation was more intense than he had anticipated. "Yes," Alexander replied simply. "We know everything, Vivian. The stolen charity funds, the media payments, the business deals. All of it." Vivian's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, anger, and then something that resembled relief. For a moment, the mask she had worn for years completely fell away, revealing the calculating person underneath. "How much does Edmund know?" she asked, dropping all pretense of innocence. "Enough," Alexander replied. "Enough to understand that his trust in you was completely misplaced." What followed was a conversation that would forever change Alexander's understanding of human nature. Rather than showing remorse or trying to justify her actions, Vivian became coldly practical about her situation. She seemed almost impressed that Alexander had uncovered the full scope of her activities. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, settling into a chair as if they were discussing the weather. "Everyone expects you to be grateful for the privilege of being part of this family, but nobody talks about the costs. The constant scrutiny, the loss of privacy, the endless obligations. I figured I deserved some compensation for my sacrifice." Alexander was stunned by her casual attitude toward what amounted to years of systematic theft and betrayal. She spoke as if she had been entitled to steal from charities and sell royal secrets because royal life was inconvenient for her. "Those charities helped children, elderly people, families in crisis," Alexander said, his anger beginning to show. "You stole from people who needed help." Vivian shrugged. "The charities got plenty of publicity from Royal Association. That's worth something too. Besides, the amounts I took were small compared to their overall budgets." This callous dismissal of the real harm she had caused revealed the depth of Vivian's selfishness. She had completely compartmentalized her actions, refusing to acknowledge the real-world consequences of her crimes. In her mind, she was the victim, forced to endure royal life, and therefore entitled to whatever compensation she could arrange for herself. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Alexander pressed her about the foreign business connections. Vivian revealed that she had been much more strategic in her approach than they had realized. She had deliberately cultivated relationships with wealthy international businesspeople who were interested in gaining access to royal events and endorsements. "It's just business," she explained. "Wealthy people want prestige, and royal associations provide prestige. I was simply facilitating mutually beneficial arrangements." Alexander realized that Vivian had essentially been running a private business using royal family access as her product. She had been selling their reputation, their charitable associations, and their private information as if these were commodities that belonged to her personally. During their confrontation, Vivian also revealed that she had been documenting her own activities meticulously. She had kept detailed records of every transaction, every media payment, and every business deal. Initially, Alexander thought this might be evidence of guilt or poor judgment, but Vivian explained her reasoning with chilling clarity. "Insurance," she said. "If anyone ever discovered what I was doing, I wanted to be able to prove that I wasn't acting alone." Several people in the palace administration helped facilitate some of these arrangements. Some members of the royal staff knew more than they let on. "If I go down, I'm not going down alone." This revelation changed everything. Alexander had assumed that Vivian was operating independently, but she was now threatening to expose other members of the royal household staff who might have been complicit in her schemes. The scandal could spread far beyond just her actions and potentially implicate people who had served the royal family faithfully for years. The meeting was interrupted when King Edmund appeared in the doorway. He looked terrible, pale, gaunt, and obviously suffering from the stress of recent revelations. However, there was a steely determination in his eyes that Alexander recognized from childhood memories of his father making difficult royal decisions. "Leave us," the king said to Sir Marcus and Alexander. "I need to speak with my wife privately." Alexander hesitated, concerned about his father's emotional and physical state. However, Edmund's tone made it clear that this was not a request but a royal command. Both Alexander and Sir Marcus withdrew, leaving the king alone with Vivian. From the hallway outside the office, they could hear raised voices but could not make out specific words. The confrontation between husband and wife lasted nearly 2 hours, during which time Alexander paced anxiously, and Sir Marcus made discreet phone calls to legal advisors and palace security. When King Edmund finally emerged from the office, he looked somehow both broken and resolved. Vivian remained inside, and Alexander could hear her making phone calls, though to whom, he could not determine. "It's over," the king said quietly. "Our marriage is over, and her time in this family is over. But the situation is more complicated than we thought." King Edmund explained that Vivian had indeed been keeping detailed records of her activities, and some of these records implicated other people. She was now threatening to release these records publicly if criminal charges were filed against her. This would create a massive scandal that would not only damage the royal family, but also destroy the lives of several innocent staff members who had been manipulated into facilitating her schemes. The king had proposed a deal. Vivian would quietly leave the royal family, return all stolen money, and sign agreements never to speak publicly about royal family matters. In exchange, the family would not pursue criminal charges and would allow her to maintain some dignity in her departure. Alexander was troubled by this arrangement. While he understood the practical benefits of avoiding a public scandal, he felt that allowing Vivian to escape without facing legal consequences was fundamentally unjust. The people she had stolen from deserved to see justice served. However, his father explained additional complications that Alexander had not considered. If the case went to court, it would require extensive testimony from royal family members and palace staff. The royal family's financial records would be examined in detail and potentially made public. The entire charitable operation of the monarchy would be scrutinized, potentially damaging relationships with legitimate charitable partners. Moreover, King Edmund's health was deteriorating rapidly under the stress. His physicians had warned that continued stress could have serious consequences for his recovery from recent heart problems. A prolonged legal battle might literally cost him his life. As evening approached, the three men, King Edmund, Alexander, and Sir Marcus, found themselves in the difficult position of having to choose between justice and stability. The decision they made would affect not only their own family, but potentially the entire future of the monarchy. Princess Catherine arrived from London that evening, having been summoned by Alexander. Her presence added another perspective to their deliberations, as she approached the situation with the practical mindset of someone trained in law but not emotionally invested in protecting royal traditions at any cost. The family meeting that followed would determine not only Vivian's fate, but also establish principles for how the royal family would handle crisis management in the future. The family meeting took place in the king's private drawing room, a space that had witnessed countless important decisions throughout the monarchy's history. King Edmund sat in his usual chair, looking exhausted but determined. Alexander and Catherine flanked him, while Sir Marcus stood near the fireplace with a folder containing all the evidence they had gathered. Princess Catherine had spent the afternoon reviewing the evidence with the analytical eye of someone trained in law. Her assessment was both thorough and troubling. While the evidence against Vivian was overwhelming, Catherine identified several legal complications that would make a criminal prosecution extremely difficult. The problem, Catherine explained, is that many of Vivian's activities existed in legal gray areas. The charity funds were diverted, but they passed through legitimate financial channels. Her media payments could be characterized as consulting fees. Even her foreign business dealings, while ethically problematic, might not constitute clear criminal activity. This analysis was frustrating but important. It meant that even if they decided to pursue criminal charges, conviction would not be certain. A failed prosecution would be even more damaging to the royal family than the current situation, as it would create maximum public attention with minimum accountability for Vivian's actions. King Edmund listened to his children's analysis before sharing what he had learned during his private confrontation with Vivian. The conversation had been devastating on a personal level, but it had also revealed information crucial to their decision-making process. "She never loved me," the king said quietly. "She admitted that our entire relationship was calculated from the beginning. She researched our family's financial structure, our charitable obligations, our public commitments. She approached me at that charity gala 3 years ago specifically because she had identified opportunities to exploit her potential position." This revelation was particularly painful for Alexander to hear. He had watched his father emerge from years of grief following his mother's death, and had been genuinely happy to see Edmund find companionship again. Learning that this relationship had been built on deception from the very first meeting was heartbreaking. Catherine asked practical questions about Vivian's current situation. Where was she staying? What assets did she control? What was her immediate plan? These questions were important because they would affect whatever agreement the family might reach with her. King Edmund explained that Vivian was currently in the guest wing of the palace, but she had been making arrangements to leave. She had significant funds available, some legitimate, some from her criminal activities, and she had connections internationally that could help her establish a new life elsewhere. However, she also understood that her future would be much more comfortable if she could reach an agreement with the royal family that avoided criminal prosecution. The negotiation process was being handled discreetly through Sir Marcus, who was serving as an intermediary between the family and Vivian's newly hired legal representation. The lawyers on both sides were working to develop an agreement that would address the royal family's concerns while protecting Vivian from criminal liability. Alexander remained deeply uncomfortable with the idea of allowing Vivian to escape accountability. His sense of justice demanded that she face consequences for her actions, particularly given the harm done to charitable organizations and the betrayal of public trust. However, he was also forced to confront the practical realities of their situation. "What about the people she stole from?" Alexander asked. "Don't we have an obligation to them to see justice done?" Catherine had been considering this question as well. She proposed a solution that might address both justice and practical concerns. The royal family could make full restitution to all affected charities, while also implementing new oversight procedures to prevent similar problems in the future. This would ensure that the victims were made whole, even if Vivian herself did not face criminal penalties. King Edmund supported this approach, seeing it as a way to maintain the royal family's integrity while avoiding the chaos that would result from a public scandal. The cost of full restitution would be significant, approximately £20 million when interest and administrative costs were included, but the royal family could absorb this expense without serious financial difficulty. More important than the money was the question of public disclosure. How much, if anything, should be revealed about what had happened? The agreement being negotiated with Vivian included strict confidentiality clauses that would prevent her from speaking publicly about royal family matters. However, the family still needed to decide what they would say about her sudden departure. Catherine suggested that they could announce a mutual decision to divorce, citing the personal incompatibility that often led to the breakdown of high-profile marriages. This would allow Vivian to leave with some dignity while avoiding questions about criminal behavior. The timing could be managed to minimize media attention and public speculation. However, Alexander worried about the precedent this would set. If members of the royal family could commit serious crimes and escape accountability through private agreements, what message did this send about justice and equality under the law? How could they continue to serve as moral leaders if they were willing to cover up criminal behavior within their own family? This philosophical debate continued throughout the evening as the family struggled with questions that had no easy answers. They were forced to balance multiple competing interests: justice for victims, protection of innocent palace staff, preservation of the monarchy's stability, concern for the king's health, and maintenance of public trust. Sir Marcus provided practical guidance based on his decades of experience managing royal family crises. While this situation was unprecedented in its scope, the general principles of crisis management remained the same: act swiftly, minimize damage, and focus on protecting the institution rather than individuals. The monarchy has survived much worse than this, Sir Marcus reminded them. Scandals, wars, constitutional crises. What matters is that we handle this situation with integrity and that we learn from it to prevent similar problems in the future. As midnight approached, the family reached a tentative decision. They would proceed with the negotiated agreement that allowed Vivian to leave quietly in exchange for full restitution and confidentiality. However, they would also implement comprehensive reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. These reforms would include independent oversight of all royal charitable activities, enhanced background checks for anyone marrying into the royal family, and new financial controls that would make it impossible for any individual to divert funds without detection. The changes would be significant and might be somewhat inconvenient, but they would ensure that the royal family's charitable work maintained the highest standards of integrity. The decision was not unanimous. Alexander remained uncomfortable with allowing Vivian to escape criminal prosecution, feeling that this sent the wrong message about accountability and justice. However, he ultimately agreed to support the family consensus, recognizing that his role as future king required him to consider the broader implications of their actions. Catherine supported the practical compromise while insisting that the family must be completely transparent about the reforms being implemented. The public deserved to know that changes were being made, even if they could not know all the details about why these changes were necessary. King Edmund was simply relieved that a resolution was possible that would allow him to focus on his health and remaining royal duties. The stress of recent weeks had taken a severe toll on his physical condition, and his physicians had been increasingly concerned about his ability to continue his royal responsibilities. As the meeting concluded, each family member understood that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Their decision would affect not only their own lives, but potentially the entire future of the monarchy. The weight of this responsibility was sobering, but they were committed to moving forward with dignity and integrity. The implementation of their decision would begin immediately, starting with final negotiations with Vivian's representatives and preparation for her departure from royal life. The final week of Duchess Vivian's time as a member of the royal family was carefully orchestrated to maintain the appearance of normalcy while facilitating her departure. Alexander found himself managing the complex logistics of what amounted to a diplomatic evacuation, ensuring that every detail was handled discreetly to prevent media speculation. The negotiated agreement had been finalized after 3 days of intensive legal discussions. Vivian would return approximately £18 million through various mechanisms, including the sale of jewelry and other gifts she had received as a royal family member. The remaining funds would be covered by the royal family's private resources, ensuring that all affected charities received full compensation for their losses. In exchange, all potential criminal charges would be dropped, and Vivian would sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that would legally prevent her from discussing royal family matters for the rest of her life. Violation of these agreements would trigger automatic financial penalties and potential criminal prosecution for breach of contract. Alexander was struck by how efficiently Vivian managed her departure once the agreement was reached. Her emotional distress seemed to evaporate, replaced by the same calculating efficiency that had characterized her criminal activities. She had clearly been preparing for this possibility and had contingency plans already in place. King Edmund avoided his wife during her final days in the palace, delegating all interactions to Alexander and palace staff. The king's physician had prescribed rest and reduced stress, and any direct contact with Vivian would have undermined his recovery. Alexander found himself serving as a buffer between his father and the woman who had betrayed them all so completely. The cover story for Vivian's departure was carefully crafted to be both believable and consistent with the family's values. Palace communications staff prepared statements about mutual recognition that the marriage had been incompatible with royal life, emphasizing respect for privacy during a difficult personal transition. The timing was coordinated with other news events to minimize media attention. Princess Catherine took charge of implementing the promised reforms to prevent similar situations in the future. Working with legal advisors and financial experts, she developed comprehensive new procedures for monitoring royal charitable activities. These included independent auditing, separation of personal and official financial channels, and enhanced oversight of all family members' business activities. The most significant reform was the establishment of an independent board of trustees to oversee all royal charitable funds. This board would include respected figures from business, law, and charitable organizations, providing external oversight that would make future theft much more difficult. While this reduced the royal family's direct control over their charitable work, it significantly increased transparency and accountability. Alexander personally visited each of the charitable organizations that had been affected by Vivian's theft. He delivered private apologies and explanations, ensuring that they understood the royal family's commitment to making full restitution. These conversations were difficult, but necessary, as maintaining trust with charitable partners was crucial for the monarchy's future effectiveness. During these visits, Alexander was struck by the grace and understanding shown by most charitable leaders. They recognized that the royal family had also been victims of Vivian's deception, and they appreciated the family's commitment to making things right. However, Alexander also encountered some skepticism about the royal family's oversight procedures and demands for greater transparency in the future. One particularly challenging conversation was with Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who ran a children's hospital that had been promised major funding for a new cancer treatment wing. The diverted funds had delayed construction by over a year, during which time children had continued to suffer from inadequate facilities. "I understand that your family was deceived," Mrs. Hayes said during their meeting. "But these delays have real consequences for real children. How can we be certain this will never happen again?" Alexander found himself making personal commitments that went beyond the official agreements. He promised Mrs. Hayes that he would personally visit the hospital quarterly to review progress and ensure that promised funds were being delivered appropriately. These commitments would be time-consuming and would require him to take on additional oversight responsibilities, but he felt they were necessary to restore trust. The implementation of new financial controls required extensive coordination with banks, investment firms, and government agencies. Sir Marcus worked 18-hour days to establish new accounts, implement new oversight procedures, and ensure compliance with both royal protocols and financial regulations. The process was complicated by the need to maintain security and privacy while also providing greater transparency. Meanwhile, King Edmund's health continued to be a serious concern. His physicians recommended that he reduce his official duties significantly, focusing only on essential ceremonial functions while allowing Alexander to handle most administrative responsibilities. This transition had been planned for the future anyway, but Vivian's betrayal had accelerated the timeline considerably. The king's emotional recovery was proving more difficult than his physical recovery. He had trusted Vivian completely, and learning that their entire relationship had been a calculated deception had shattered his confidence in his own judgment. Palace physicians and counselors were working with him to address both his depression and his anxiety about the monarchy's future. Alexander found himself shouldering responsibilities that he had expected to assume gradually over several more years. While he felt prepared for most royal duties, the sudden increase in his workload was challenging. He was essentially functioning as regent while maintaining the fiction that his father remained fully capable of governing. The media management aspects of the situation proved particularly complex. Royal correspondents had noticed changes in family dynamics and scheduling, leading to speculation about problems within the household. The palace communications team worked carefully to provide just enough information to satisfy media curiosity without revealing anything about the true scope of recent events. 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, Duchess Vivian quietly left Aldermere Palace for the final time. She had accepted a position with an international consulting firm based in Geneva, providing her with both income and distance from British media attention. Her departure was announced as a mutual decision to pursue separate paths, with expressions of respect and wishes for future happiness. The announcement generated moderate media interest but was quickly overshadowed by other news events. Most coverage focused on speculation about whether the king would remarry again, with little attention paid to the specific circumstances of Vivian's departure. The palace communication strategy had successfully managed the narrative to minimize damaging speculation. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and continued anger as he watched Vivian's car disappear through the palace gates. Relief that the immediate crisis was over, but anger that she would essentially escape accountability for her crimes. He knew that this emotional conflict would probably remain with him for years to come. In the months following Vivian's departure, the new oversight systems proved their worth by identifying several minor irregularities in charitable fund management that had existed before her arrival. While these were not criminal activities, they demonstrated the value of enhanced monitoring and led to additional procedural improvements. King Edmund gradually began to recover his emotional equilibrium, though he remained more cautious and reserved than he had been before his marriage to Vivian. He focused increasingly on his ceremonial duties while leaving most administrative decisions to Alexander. The transition of power was happening naturally, though earlier than anyone had anticipated. Alexander's relationship with his father evolved during this period. The shared experience of confronting Vivian's betrayal had created a deeper bond between them, based on mutual respect and understanding of the difficult decisions required by royal life. They met regularly to discuss both official business and personal matters, maintaining open communication about the challenges they faced. Princess Catherine took on expanded roles in royal charitable work, using her legal background to ensure compliance with new oversight procedures. Her involvement added credibility to the royal family's commitment to transparency and reform, helping to rebuild relationships with charitable partners. 6 months after Vivian's departure, Alexander reflected on what they had learned from the crisis. The experience had been devastating personally, but had also strengthened the royal family's commitment to integrity and accountability. The new oversight systems would make them more effective charitable partners, even if they also required more work and provided less flexibility. Most importantly, the crisis had demonstrated the resilience of the monarchy as an institution. Despite facing internal betrayal and potential public scandal, the royal family had managed to address the problem responsibly while maintaining public trust. This experience would serve them well in facing whatever challenges the future might bring. As Alexander looked toward his own future reign, he carried lessons about trust, responsibility, and the constant vigilance required to maintain institutional integrity. The crown's secret had been exposed and dealt with, leaving the monarchy stronger and more accountable than it had been before. The scars from Vivian's betrayal would always remain, but they would serve as permanent reminders of the price of trust and the importance of maintaining the highest standards of integrity in service to the people they were sworn to protect. End of story. This fictional story explores themes of trust, duty, and moral leadership within the context of a royal family crisis. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created for dramatic purposes.